Are we ready to go, Stephen and Georgie? Great. It's 2 minutes past 7, so we're going to kick off because I know people have dinner to have and other things. So thank you very much for joining tonight's budget Zoom. I'm Allegra Spender, member for Wentworth, and we're on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land, and wanted to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. It's a bit cold in Canberra, so I'm a bit rugged up. And I'm here with Georgie and Stephen from my team who helped me both, Stephen particularly on general economics, innovation and tax, and Georgie particularly also on climate and energy, and both incredibly helpful and useful on budget. So I'm going to actually hand over to them because they're going to ask me questions tonight. And what we're going to do is they're going to ask me some questions, including some of the questions that were provided in advance. Then we will also gather some of the questions through that are sort of shared in the chat and work out some of those. So feel free to pop any questions you have in the chat. Otherwise, we will start out with some questions that we've got in advance as well as some broad reflections. Over to you guys.
Hi, everyone. Allegra,
You're on mute.
We shouldn't be. Can you hear us? Can you hear us? Vix? Oh, sorry guys, we're just having some issues.
Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. That was my fault. You're not on mute. I just couldn't hear you. Sorry, guys. Stephen and Georgie, go for it.
So it's Parliament's night of nights. How do you go about preparing for budget night?
Okay. Look, I think a couple of things we do. Firstly is understanding what people want. And so that's actually something, understanding what the community wants. So that's something we do, I think, 24/7, 365 days a year is really listening, often having community groups come and talk to us, but also just talking to constituents. So that is a big part of it, and then building policies around it. In the lead up to budget, I also speak to a couple of, at least a few key economists to understand what they're looking for, what they would judge a good budget to be, particularly in the case of things like productivity and inflation, which I think are two really significant issues at the moment. And then one of the big things you do is try and pack good snacks.
That's very important.
The M&M's got us through.
Yeah.
And what were you looking to see as you were heading into the budget lockup?
Yeah, I wanted to see four things. What I wanted to recognize was, we've got really big, both short-term and long-term challenges right now, and that's the challenge of the budget. We have obviously the war in Iran, the impact that it is having on inflation, but we also had inflation growing anyway, before the Iran war kicked off. So that's some of the sort of significant, really short-term challenges. But we also have really some longer term challenges that, need to be dealt with, because otherwise you just sort of focus on the short term and you never deal with some of the big issues. Some of those big issues are obviously low productivity, which, sounds like just economic speak for, people working harder. But honestly, if we don't grow productivity in our businesses and also in our government services, then real wages just don't go up. We know that productivity growth is actually the source of real wages. People really worried about housing has been a really big issue. Just, the inflation and the cost of living pressures, and this sense that, people have good jobs but just feel under stress. And then it's also, and I'm trying to be a downer, and those are some of the sort of, factors that we've got right now that actually need longer term fixes. So I was looking for four things in the budget. Firstly was support for the most vulnerable, because I thought, a really targeted support, but for people who are struggling the most. The second piece was really about not adding to inflation, so really significant spending restraint. Also because the government spending is a really high percentage of GDP, compared to historical averages. Thirdly was meaningful tax reform on trying to deal with both growing sort of productivity and business investment, but also helping young people and just more Australians be able to build financial success for themselves. And then finally was productivity. So government sort of doing the right things or not doing the wrong things to try and ensure to build kind of the productivity of our businesses in particular, but also of our government services.
Great. And to one of the points you mentioned there, how did the budget help with cost of living, if at all?
Yeah, I think probably it was pretty limited. And that, I know there was a question from one of the people who put in advance. I think, so inflation and interest rates are actually the biggest drivers of cost of living pain, I think, at the moment. And I think the budget it actually confirmed real wages fall of 1.75% this year. So I was hoping for a contractionary budget, so a budget that didn't put more money into the economy. The budget didn't deliver that. It didn't deliver a particularly expansionary budget. It was $6.5 billion worth of extra measures, of policy measures. But still, I really overall didn't want to see that. I appreciate that, there have been a lot of pressures on things like buying fuel and things like that the government has tried to put in. But I was hoping that we wouldn't have that sort of expansion in the budget.
Uh, Kay submitted a question in advance asking, has this budget made any difference to intergenerational inequity?
Yeah. It's a really good question. And I mean, I think firstly that we should just talk about intergenerational inequity. What does it mean? Because it's really going on. It's really it's a big sort of topic of conversation. There's a economist who said there are kind of three types of equity, and I think they're all important. So vertical equity is the idea that in this country we believe that if you have more capacity to pay, you should pay more. You should make more of a contribution. So the sort of progressiveness of our tax system. Horizontal equity is the idea that people of similar means pay similar, have similar kind of things like pay similar amounts of tax. And then there's intergenerational equity, which is really saying that what each generation is leaving the next generation is effectively fair. And I think that what people and there's few worries going on at the moment. I think people are worried about that what you're seeing is young people not meeting the same milestones as their parents unless they have help. So people, we're seeing younger Australians about 20 percentage points lower owning of homes. We're seeing that they're not having kids as much. So there's some really big struggles that younger Australians are having. And what's happening is that if you're, particularly if you have a family who is willing to help you out, if you're, have older parents who can provide you with money, then that has made a big difference to people. And that's where you're seeing sort of intergenerational inequity in the sense that one generation is not meeting the same milestones as the previous generation, and then you get it intra-generational within the generation inequity where some people get help from their parents so can actually achieve milestones. Some people maybe earning the same amount of money doing similar jobs don't get help from their parents and so can't achieve the same milestones. And that's some of the stuff that we're doing. These are the worry. So that's a long answer, long kind of set out. I think that the budget has a chance to make a contribution to reducing intergenerational inequity in the sense of helping more young people build the lives and opportunity that their parents did. But it's not a done deal, and there's certainly much more work to be done. There's been some work, particularly, we'll talk a lot about tax. There's some stuff and housing, and I think it really comes down to some of the stuff around tax and housing is really important here, but also things like productivity growth is super important here, and adding more to government debt goes the opposite direction of making each generation sort of better off. So that's going in the opposite direction.
Well, that's probably a good segue into tax, which was obviously a massive part of the budget, Allegra. For those who haven't been following it as closely or catching up, do you want to give us a quick rundown of what change has been proposed in the budget on tax?
Yeah, sure. So there are kind of two sets of changes. One set is around the personal income tax system. The other set is around more on the business tax system. I think most of the energy has been focused around the personal tax system, and this is an area where I've done a lot of work before as well, and released a white paper in this space. So what's happened is the government has done really sort of five things. It has done a small tax, what they call is WAPO, which is a small tax sort of raising of tax threshold for people who are working, which is going to be an equivalent to around $250 per person ongoing in terms of a tax break if you're working from, I think it's 2028. So 27, 28. Then it has, then what it has done, the government is proposing is to change the treatment of capital gain of assets in terms of how they're paid for in capital gains, going from the model now where you have a 50% capital gains tax discount after you hold an asset for 1 year to what they call indexation, which is that you pay your normal marginal rate, but only on the amount of the asset that is not inflation. So you just inflation and adjust the base of an asset. So if it was you bought it $100, you sold it at $200, and you had approximately 5 years of inflation, at say 5%. Hopefully we won't be there. That means that your reduction you would approximate that would mean that the new base for that asset is $130. So you'd pay your normal marginal rate, but only on the difference between your base that has been adjusted up for inflation. Then the government has stopped negative gearing for all properties except new properties. So that's going to be grandfathered in for existing and people who are negatively geared, but no more negative gearing for property. Some changes so that there's a minimum distribution price on trusts to try and stop people income split, using trust to income split and other things, and then also a minimum tax rate and a minimum real tax rate on capital earnings. So it's quite a complex. I mean, honestly, they're quite complex changes, and so we're still getting our heads around them. There are bits we like, bits we don't, and bits we're still trying to work out because some potential unintended consequences. But certainly where the government is saying it's focused is about how to try and reduce some of the tilt the tax balance back towards home ownership as opposed to investors, because investors in real estate, because that has been a significant issue.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few questions coming through on some of those issues on the tax, questions about the impact on innovation, as well as the impact on younger people looking to invest in assets that aren't housing. These are some things that we've been looking at over the last couple of days, but any reflections that you've got at the moment on those two issues?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing is, I'm glad the government's put tax on the table, and I'll tell you where I'm nervous about it. One is that there's what they have done is put, the tax they put into the budget is about $100 billion increase in tax over the next 10 years, but $77 billion worth of that tax isn't being returned to people, to individuals. And that's, for me, a real issue, because I think it's really important that if you are going to change the tax treatment of assets or other things, you should give that back to all Australians in terms of broader tax cuts and actually lowering their marginal rates, because I think that's really important. So that is one thing I'm concerned about what the government has done. The second piece is on the CGT discount. We've been looking at the CGT discount, which is very generous, particularly has been very generous in terms of property, and across different asset classes, and a bit arbitrary that, if you hold it for a year, you get immediately a 50% discount. And, the concern I have had compared to, say, if you're earning on your wages, you get a much bigger discount you pay much less tax, if you earn 100 grand through CGT than you do on your wages. So if you earn 100 grand, you pay about $23,000 worth of tax. If it's on wages, you pay about $7,000 worth of tax if you earn that through capital growth. So that's been an area where I've been saying, look, I think we probably need to reduce some of these capital gains tax discounts. Where the government has gone is they have gone back to this sort of indexing model I was just describing, which we had before 1999. I think the concern I have with that, and that I'm really working through with some of the startup community and with people in the tech community and people in business, is to say, look, that sort of discount is potentially bad for the startup industry. Because if you're starting particularly a company that doesn't have a lot of capital, it's just you and your friend and, maybe, only $10,000 worth of equipment, but that's of your initial capital. The amount of tax you can theoretically would pay if you sold that business and you didn't, it's not a high capital business, it's just a lot of people working in that business. That would be a much higher capital rate than you would in a normal under the current CGT arrangements. Ditto in some sorts of, and people are also worried, and I share those worries about sort of directing people's investments into lower growth types of investments. So this is the stuff that we're just at the moment trying to get our heads around and really talk to the startup community. I've raised this already with the treasurer and said, look, I think I'm genuinely concerned that we have to reward risk and innovation. There is a risk that if we don't, you will lose companies overseas, and people won't want to start up businesses here. So the CGT changes I think have been put forward for a variety of good reasonable economic reasons, but the practical impact on particularly on people and entrepreneurship could be really, really the opposite of what we want. So that's the big area that I'm focused on, particularly on the CGT stuff. And I'm listening to everyone in this, and that's one of the reasons why we're doing this Zoom, and I'm getting lots of feedback and emails and everything, because what I'm hearing is there's a lot of concern out there on this, and there's also some concern on sort of reducing CGT discounts for sort of other types of assets.
It sounds like what was in frame for the government was around housing affordability, with reforming, making some of these tax changes. Are you optimistic that house prices will come down? We're getting a few questions on that, including from Peter.
Yeah. Look, I don't. I think that the budget says that it's going to come down by maybe around 2%, and most experts would say that sort of changes to CGT and negative gearing will reduce house prices by 1 to 4%. So it's not a very big price effect. What I think it will do, and I think what the budget's papers suggest, is that it will tilt the balance back towards people who own their own home, but towards people buying homes. So you hear a lot from people who are really struggling, where they go to an auction and they're just being outbid by by investors who are using the sort of negative gearing and capital gains tax discounts, and are buying these homes, renting them out, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It is important to have rental properties, but we've got a tax system that has been really pushing, effectively really pushing investment into leveraged property, because that's where our current capital gains tax discount and our negative gearing tax incentives really interact and really push the attractiveness of this asset. So I think that it is. I think that we will see some growth, and the government estimates 75,000 more new owner occupiers will get into housing. And they're also putting extra money into infrastructure building, so about $2 billion into sort of infrastructure for like sewage and stuff like that the states deliver. So they think collectively that we're going to end up with 30,000 more new homes out of some of that, plus other things they're doing, including investment in AI planning tools and a bunch of different things that they're trying to do to try and push housing supply. So the truth is, there's no silver bullet on housing. Supply is critical, but it takes time. It's not really in the federal government's control. So what they're trying to do is incentivize that. And I'm a big supporter of that $2 billion investment. I think it is the sort of investment that can help drive housing construction, which I think is really important.
Cool. And just before we sort of move on to some questions from the audience, there's a question from Christian asking about the difference between the gas reservation policy. Obviously, gas was a big topic last week with the Senate inquiry. What are the main differences between a gas reservation policy versus the PRRT? And what are the other proposals? Were you happy with this policy response on gas?
Yeah, sure. It's a good question. So, to be honest, I'm not really happy with where the government is at on gas. And I think, and gas and taxation, I think it's one of the disappointments of the budget. So for those people who haven't been following it, we get royalties, PRRT, the Petroleum Rent Resource Tax, and and taxation from sort of gas companies. And what we've seen over the last sort of 30 years is that we've gone from around 30 cents in the dollar going to, through tax and royalties in oil and gas. Coming to the Australian government, and now that's down to 6 or 7 cents. So and the PRRT itself is not working. So I think we needed to see gas tax reform. We didn't see it in this budget. I think they were quite close, but they balked at it. And this is something that I think it's really important to keep on pushing. In terms of the reservation policy, again, I actually think this is an important policy. Western Australia has had a gas domestic reservation policy since around 2006. And what we've seen actually in the East Coast, where we haven't had a reservation policy, is that domestic prices have actually tripled. Despite an increase in supply. So since we started exporting, domestic prices have actually tripled, even though we've had a massive increase in supply of gas from the East Coast. So it just hasn't worked for us. So the government has said, and so the opportunity for gas reservation policies, you can de-link domestic prices from volatile international markets. That's why we need to have it. It's complicated to bring in when we've got lots of existing contracts. So, and the government has sort of said, yes, we're going to do this. We are bringing in domestic supply gas reservation policy, but they haven't given us any detail, and they really need to work this detail out with the companies. So I'd say that it was more of an announcement to distract us from the fact that they weren't doing a gas tax rather than actually new policy announcement. And there's a lot of work to do in this area.
Jeff's asked a question in the chat, highlighting that the Iran war has highlighted our kind of vulnerabilities with respect to our imported liquid fuels. Have you considered whether a limited strategic increase in domestic oil and gas development could enhance the short to medium term energy security and resilience?
Yeah, sure. So from a gas point of view, we've got lots of gas. Like I don't think it's, there's gas is very powerful right now because we're an exporter and it is actually a really great leverage for us. But I think that, and there is exploration going on in gas as at the moment. I think in oil, the challenge for Australia is that we actually don't have that much, we don't have that many reserves. So I think the estimate, and correct me if I'm wrong, Georgie, but it's something that, we've only got, if you sort of drilled our wells dry, it's only about 7 years worth of reserves here in Australia. So we're not well endowed on sort of affordable oil. What we are well endowed on is gas, coal, uranium, sun and wind. And so when I think about how do we, I think we do need to build up our stockpiles of liquid fuels. I think that's important. I think the government's done well to do that. I think we also need to, where we can, electrify because, the sun and the wind, we know that and batteries, we can maintain those even when there is some sort of crisis. And, families who are not exposed right now to the petrol price, sort of spikes, are doing much better than others. So I think we've got to do work in sort of electrification. That doesn't happen overnight. So I think we have to also invest, as I said, in that fuel security piece. I don't think it's really going to come that much from more local production because we're just not that well endowed in terms of oil reserves. There's a bit of a chat of, should we open more oil refineries? I think the point is right now is there's actually heaps of refining capabilities across Asia. What we don't have is actually the crude oil. So that is the biggest limiting factor at the moment. And Stephen and Georgie, feel free to correct me if I say something that's not quite right.
Nothing so far. We're getting quite a few questions going back to tax, and apologies, everyone. We might jump around a fair bit, but there's a question from Mark just asking about on the CGT matters. There is an upside, right? That if we are able to sort of housing and asset class stops becoming so easy to leverage, won't that make more funds available to high growth industries?
Look, I think you're right, and I think what we do want to do is redirect, investment in this country towards productive businesses. Like that's, how you think of how do you grow the economy? It's actually not by us, making more expensive housing or, bidding housing up between ourselves, which is I think what we have been doing a lot in the last 20 years. It is actually building, exciting businesses. So I think you're right, it will unlock capital, which won't be as, housing as that asset class for investors won't be as attractive. So I think that some of these changes could have that positive impact.
And there's a question on trusts as well
Mhm.
while we're on tax.
Mm.
Some concerns around how this affects testamentary trusts that look after, so people might set this up to help um, minors or family members with a disability or adult beneficiaries, and how that doesn't appear to be in the list of carve-outs.
That's a good question. That's a really good question. That's not a question I've heard before. And I think Stephen, we should put that on the list of questions. We are, because I think honestly, with the stuff on trust, it's still, we don't have the legislation. It's still what we can read in the budget papers. And I think that's a very, very fair question. So Stephen, can we put that on our list of, things that we're going through? Because what we're doing at the moment is you're trying to get our head around exactly what's in the budget and also understand what the concerns, the questions, and what's important to people. So that as the legislation is developed, as policies, sort of, are being pushed around, and certainly, on the startup space, I know because I've asked, is that the Treasury is engaging with some of the startup industry to see how they can, how some of these, I think, poor consequences for the startup sector can be managed, or, are there programs that could fix this? This is the work that we're trying to do right now. It's like where we see problems, make sure we raise them and see if we can address them. Do you have
Yeah,
anything to add on
it
that,
looks like there
Stephen?
might be it looks like there might be. I'm just looking at budget paper one. It looks like there might be something in discretionary testamentary trusts. I think Kimberly asked a question there, so leave that one with us, and we'll follow up with that because, as Allegra said, it's an important issue, and it's just not clear from the budget papers yet how that'll be treated.
And the budget's not all about tax, it's also about how the government is spending money. So what was in the budget for the art sector?
That's a good question. I know that came from one of the constituents. Unfortunately, there's nothing in really the budget for the arts sector. So it was not a good budget for the arts.
Anything for the LGBTQI plus
Yeah,
community?
there will be, I'm sorry, on the outside, there are, I think, individual organizations who got some money as well as, and, so I'm just conscious that, but it's not sort of a overall kind of funding injection, for the arts. For the LGBTQ community, there was some more money invested in terms of eliminating HIV transmission. Australia would be the first country in the world to eliminate HIV transmission, and also to provide PrEP to people who are not eligible for Medicare. And then there's also been some continuity of funding for the National Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Agreement, which was due to expire at the end of June this year. So those are some of the things on for the LGBTQ community, including on the mental health front.
And anything for the environment?
So there were bits and pieces for the environment, but again, it was. I'm sorry, I'm going to page by page because not everything is in front of me. Um, Look, I think one of the ones that I'm excited by is one that actually constituents in Wentworth have really been pushing, which is active transport. So, Brooke, if you're watching, the government has put forward a $500 million to extend the active transport fund. I think this is really important because this is about it's both about quality of life and health and mental health as well as congestion, and I think that's a really important part of the budget. I'm really delighted to see that. I think most of the focus on the environment has been around things like the fuel security programs. On climate, the one that's, the big sort of behemoth is the cheaper home battery program. That has really grown super fast. So I think that's cost a lot of money, but I think has also been good for the resilience of the grid and also good for households who can then better manage their own, energy costs. So I think that's been a really important part. That's actually been helping driving gas out of the whole out and also wholesale electricity prices down, which is great. There's a bit of money to improve marine park management, and they established the National Environmental Protection Agency. Now that really comes out of the EPBC reforms that happened at the end of last year. So that it's not it's not direct money to animals, but it is super important because we need that protection of wildlife. We know that in many cases, those protections just haven't been managed properly. So yeah, those are them. And we did get the protected species and the Great Barrier Reef programs extended. So they were extended for another year. Otherwise, it's really the sort of existing commitments on the clean energy transition that was going ahead.
Cool. We're getting some really good questions come through, so bear with us if we don't get to them straight away. Um, there's a question from the Zoom. Why are there no moves to remove the Morrison government's Job Ready Graduates program?
Mm.
Might just give us an update on what that is and
Yeah. Yeah. So the Jobs Ready Graduate Program is a program which made certain degrees, particularly arts degrees, more expensive and made other degrees, particularly I think like nursing degrees, cheaper. Um, the real, and I think, I hear this a lot because people, particularly it was intended, I think the intention of this was to drive people more into STEM degrees and other types of careers. Unfortunately, it didn't work. It didn't drive more people in because people don't choose their degrees, solely on how much they cost. And what it has done is really put a lot of pressure on arts degrees in particular, where they've become really expensive. I've raised this with Jason Clare, the education minister, and their point is like, look, I want to do it. It's just a lot of money, and so I think the truth is we don't have, our university sector at the moment is a bit all over the shop. I think it's real area of where I don't know that we have the long-term funding structure of unis right, because we have relied a lot on overseas students. Some of that is pulling back. A lot of people are concerned about, sometimes the student experience in our university. So it's not working really. And I think and the Job Ready Graduate is part of that. I'm sort of co-hosting an event, I think in a couple of weeks' time, with people with some ideas about how this could be funded or how could be brought in. And I'm all ears because the budget is under real pressure. Spending is really high. It's at 26.8% of GDP, which is some of the highest, in long-term averages that we've ever had. So the government is spending a lot of money, but there are these things out there that people care about that are just not being done.
and we've got a question from Catherine. Beyond buying a first home, what investment pathways does this budget genuinely create for younger Australians?
Mm. I think it's a really good question, and I think that the one bit I don't think it creates new pathways. And I think, but so I don't think it's sort of trying to create new pathways. I think if we're lucky, it will drive more investment into businesses, which I think is exciting. And there is one piece there are a couple of pieces more on the innovation front, which I think are genuinely good. There's a program called, I always get the name of this wrong. Lost Carryback? No, it's not Lost Carryback. It's
Uh, yeah, lost the ESVCLPs and lost carryback and
and
refundability.
Yeah, refundability. So this is a sort of refundability loss offset. So it means that if you're starting a business, you can actually get a tax refund on your payroll costs and your FBT tax in the first couple of years. I think that's exciting, and I think it's that sort of thing which is trying to encourage people into starting their own businesses. So I think that's the piece there's nothing, there's not a sort of new investments out there. It's more about saying how do you make sure, how do we create better incentives for people and deal with some of the issues of when I talk to people who start businesses, that access to capital is really important, particularly in the first few years. So I think there's a bunch of measures trying to increase access to capital to the startup sector, but it's that intersection with the CGT stuff that we're nervous of, and that's what we're working on.
Yeah.
David's
And
pointed out that we're in $1 trillion worth of debt despite being
yeah.
one of the most resource-rich countries. Where are the opportunities for the deep cuts in spending to return kind of government expenditure back to more normal levels and reduce debt?
Yeah. Um, Now, I think the government has taken one, which I think was really important, which was working on the NDIS. And, to start out, I just want to say, I have people coming into my office and saying, the NDIS has changed their lives and I can see it, I asked some the other day and they just said, look, before we were barely clinging on. Now, we do have support. It's not perfect. There are problems, etc. But, this makes a big difference. But that's a program that even in 2015, we looked at the numbers. It was meant to cost, I think, around $25 billion or $20 billion. It's now costing this year, it's now costing sort of over 50. So it's already double. It's basically double what it was meant to be after 10 years. So the program itself, it just cannot keep growing like that. The government has put in a bunch of places measures to try and reduce that growth. I think that's the right thing, but it's going to be hard for them to deliver it because it's a tight time frame and they need to get the states on board. So I think that's a big area that the government has done in this budget. I think other areas are things like it's infrastructure spending, for instance. It's put $4 billion into the suburban rail loop in Melbourne. I think that's a bad idea. It's poorly targeted and it doesn't have a positive business case. So that's a piece I think that is super important. I am sort of probably quite controversially for some people saying I think we need to pull back on things like some of the EV FBT subsidy, and I think direct that because it's a great subsidy if you can get it, but the problem is it's a really high cost of emissions reduction. And so I think that's a broader theme is that I think what we honestly need to do is look at program by program and say, can you spend that money better? Can you achieve better outcomes with that money? So I don't think there's simple things to cut spending. I think the NDIS was probably the big one. I think probably some more means testing in some of our government services, which the government is starting to do a bit in aged care, is going to be where it goes and needs to go, because it is hard. We do have $1 trillion worth of debt. And I think we also need to look at, as I said, gas taxation, I think is an important one. Things like the overall taxation of our resources, I think is an important one, and as well as some multinationals, including some of our digital companies. And then things like the diesel fuel rebate, which again makes no sense to me, when we know we've got a crisis and trying to get get liquid fuels, that we're giving companies an incentive to stay using diesel when we don't make it ourselves. It's vulnerable in the world supply chains and it makes the climate worse. So those are some of them. Again, all ears if people have other ideas in terms of how improved government spending. But I think I once heard Paul Keating speak about this, and because he did a good job of that, and he just said it is just discipline of really, really looking at government spending. And I think, there needs to be more discipline, honestly.
You previously talked about sort of the $100,000 to households paying different levels of tax. We've got a question from Clive. How will the new tax regime equalize, if at all, the income tax between a nurse who earns 100K and a passive earner who earns 100K?
And a passive earner. So what it will do, and I think what it would do is it should, and it's not at the moment, reduce the amount of tax that the nurse pays. on her wages. It's not really doing that at the moment, but that's what I think it should, and that's what I'll continue to push the government to do. What it will do is increase some of the tax on someone who earns their income from, from capital gains in particular. So that's the kind of the trade-off that it will do. So and I'll be honest, I just want to be really clear. I think we need to make sure that capital you shouldn't be taxed the same amount as labor. And the reason really for that is particularly that capital can go. I always say it's mobile, and the danger of trying to tax capital too much is that people will take that capital and invest in other countries, and take also their entrepreneurship and invest in other countries, and that's going to be bad for productivity and growth. But we do need to, I think we do need to rebalance it at that personal level. So you still get a discount, but not quite as generous, and certainly without the what do you call it? The sort of negative gearing at the same time on housing.
Ken Henry welcomed the environmental spending on bioregional planning, the EPA, and the EIA, but says government should commit now to funding for a fully functioning nature restoration market. Is that something that you would support, and how do we build support for that?
Yeah, I think I mean, Ken's got some really exciting ideas in that space. And I think he's really thinking about how do you build markets that can fix this. So I've also spoken to him on markets in relation to critical minerals and how you could build something that can help, critical minerals. So I think he knows what he's talking about, and I'm very happy to try and engage with him in terms of this. We haven't really got into the detail with him on this recently. I think the big focus was getting the EPBC reforms, but I think he's right. The EPBC reforms still need investment in the environment.
There's a question from Anne about the reason they left out pensioners. I assume this is about potentially the WATO or the WATO, however you want to pronounce it. But maybe just reflect on what this means for older Australians, particularly those sort of looking towards retirement, or how are they sort of receiving this budget, and what was in it for them?
I think that look, there's I think sort of investment in sort of home care and aged care were probably the major areas. I don't think this was a budget and also some of the payment for things like reducing the PBS costs and things like that. So it's things that generally affect all Australians, but particularly in terms of healthcare costs and other costs, are more weighted towards people using the healthcare system, which is more typically older Australians. So this isn't a budget that was particularly, I think, focused around older Australians. I think it was focused more about younger Australians. I think in terms of things like the pension and stuff like that, most of that is indexed in a way that, and I think that's important, just as we think about this right now. They're indexed, which means that the pensions go up with inflation, but our tax brackets don't go up with inflation. And that's part of the challenge is if you are earning tax right now, particularly as a wage earner, your tax rate is just going up every year, even if you're on the same income because of bracket creep. While if you are protected have something that's indexed, you don't have that. So I know that's a hard answer when people are really struggling. But I think that is the sort of protection that is has a fair amount of impact on the budget just because of in the high level of inflation right now.
For vulnerable Australians, was there much in this budget in terms of job seeker or rent assistance? How do you feel about?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't that budget. I mean, there were pieces. There were some. There wasn't. It was mainly sort of if things that were already on the books for vulnerable Australians. There was some stuff around things like strengthening the child support scheme, which I think is important, which is really around safeguards to protect, child support being weaponized for abusive or coercive control. But things like even the food relief sector didn't get additional funding, which I think was super important. And so it was more of a budget of continuing the same investment in gender-based violence, mental health, infrastructure funding for housing. But there was, I think, important to our local community, significant investment in after Bondi, both in sort of security, mental health support, the Royal Commission itself, and sort of community events and community building actually, and sort of fighting prejudice, hate, and anti-Semitism, which I think was important. So that was actually quite a pretty big package.
There's a good question. I mean, you and I both love a chart, and I'm thinking about that chart that showed the structural deficit, Allegra. There's a question from David about how these measures will help the budget, the national debt. I noticed that there was a shift towards structural budget surplus over the by 2035 or something like that.
Mm.
But do you trust those figures, or what concerns you about that, or is that a good thing?
Look, I think that we should be, as Richard Holden, who's an economist, was saying the other day, we should be in a structural surplus. So this is the challenge in the economy right now. We've got pretty much in full employment. We've got reasonably high terms of trade. We should be in a good position, but we have, on things like gas tax and on a bunch of other stuff, we haven't made good decisions, which means that we're sort of in sustained budget deficits. Now, this budget is predicting to get back to surplus, I think, in the last 2 years or last 2 or 3 years of the budget, but that's built on basically not giving back the $77 billion of tax increases to people, and I've got a problem with that because I think when
And
you
bracket creep.
and bracket creep,
And
yeah,
bracket
exactly
creep
right,
between
and
in and
bracket
out.
creep. So it just doesn't. It's not right. It doesn't work like that. So we've got work to do. The spending restraint stuff is really important.
We've got a question from Instagram. What's the reason for the 30% tax floor on capital gains?
Mhm. So I think this is a bit technical. So, and again, I'll be honest, I'm still getting my head around it. Is that it's a 30% real tax of 30% on real gains, not on nominal gains. Now, that sounds, I'm going to just explain that really briefly. If you, again, like if you've got an asset that was $100, inflation was, running at 5%, say for 10 years, and your asset's now $150, the math isn't perfect, but you're kind of with me. And, it sells at $200. The real gain is the $50, not the $100 to $200, because some of that gain that you've got from your asset, some of the increase in your asset price is inflation and some of it is real. What they're saying is it's going to be a 30% tax rate on the real gain, which is the $50, not $100. But I think I've got a bit of concerns on the complication of this one. I think the justification in the papers is that sometimes what people do is they have their assets, and what they do is they sell them once they retire, so that they pay a lower tax rate when in terms of sale of the asset compared to when they were holding it over a longer period of time. So it's trying to sort of stop people choosing when to sell their assets based on the tax treatment of that.
Today, the CBA shares fell about 10%. CBA makes up a significant part of people's super. What do you think the impact of these reforms might be?
Um, I think, look, haven't been following the markets that closely today. I understand they also put their profit out as well, so I'm not sure if there's some of the CBA fall was also to do with that information. But they are the biggest mortgage holders, and I think that it's saying, well, there's a piece of this which is to say, if we're reducing investment in housing by investors, that might hit mortgages and mortgage holders, brokers, or like CBA. But I think the point hopefully should be is that other people come in, that young homeowners come in where CBA has where those investors step out. And if it means that the house growth moderates or the price of housing moderates, I think that is a genuinely good thing, because we are now one of the most expensive. Sydney is one of the most expensive, the second most expensive city to live in compared to all the other cities in the world after Hong Kong. If you compare how much it costs to own a home to people's wages. So we just cannot see house price growth like we have in the past. It only will make the lives of Australians much, much, much worse. So I think what I would love to see in the banking sector is actually redirecting banking towards, again, businesses. Because back in the 80s and 90s, we used to lend about one third of bank lending went to mortgages, two-thirds went to businesses. Now, two-thirds go to mortgages, one-third to businesses. So we've kind of turned our economy upside down. And I think, one benefit may come out of these changes is that we sort of push back towards business if we get these reforms right. If we deal with some of the challenges I've mentioned before on CGT, that could be a really positive thing for the economy.
We've got a question from Peter. How much do you think your work on tax has influenced the work that's come out in this budget?
I think it certainly had an impact. And so I'm proud to, I guess I've been saying we do need to work on tax. And I think, this is both the work that we did on personal tax, which I think is the most prominent, but also we've done some work on business tax, which we have been sort of sharing around as well. And some of the stuff that we wanted has come up into the budget as well. So I think it has made a difference. But I don't get to write it. That's a problem. Like you come up with ideas and say, we think you should do it this way. And then the government may take, like everyone, cherry picks a couple of things and then does some things that perhaps I don't like so much. So that's one of the challenges of this. But it's at least, so yeah, so I'd be honest, so I think it has had a significant impact. And I think saying that, we just can't continue on as we are, which is certainly what I've been doing, I think has been important.
We've got a question from Instagram. Was there anything in this budget for childcare? I know this is a big issue around
Mm.
Wentworth and the country more broadly at the moment.
Yeah. No, there wasn't anything in the budget for childcare. The government's put a lot of money in to childcare over the last few budgets, but this wasn't the one for it. And again, yeah, that is part of the challenge. And I know it's expensive, and I know that it's a real challenge in our area as well. I know we're going to wrap up in a couple of minutes. I think we're going to go to 7:45, but we are having so much fun. Do you want to last couple of questions, team? You're grilling me with the questions I haven't had.
We've got through we've got through quite a lot. Maybe just sort of to summarize, where to from here for you. On the measures in this budget, we've talked a lot about tax.
Mhm.
But what are the priorities coming out of this?
Okay.
And
Yeah.
yeah, then we
Okay.
might sort of close.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think short term, definitely really engaging on the tax stuff because as I said, the startup stuff's really, 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 really important. You know, changes that are there to help, to help try and address housing it's really important they don't hurt innovation. That would be the opposite of what we need right now. So that's something that's top of mind. And then getting into the detail on things like trusts and stuff like that to make sure that any things that the government has put forward are actually going to work in practice and are going to achieve what people want them to achieve and aren't going to have unintended consequences. So there's a lot of just like getting into the weeds now and really assessing what's been put forward by the government sort of beyond the headlines and making sure that getting really clear in my head, is it doing what it needs to do, and if it's not, how I can push back, how I can try and change things. Then more broadly, we haven't talked that much about productivity, but a big piece is a big part of the budget was actually lots of announcements on sort of regulatory reform and how to make things easier for business. We urgently need to do that. And it's funny. I was talking to actually someone who builds houses for big housing developments today, and he said, you know, he just talked about how the first time he built in this area, it took 1 year to get the DA approval. The next time he built, it took 2 years. The next time he built, it took 3.5 years. Like the productivity on things like housing approvals and stuff like that is so bad. And again, a bunch of this stuff is not in the federal government's control, but it can use its levers to try and get the states to do what it needs to do. So I'll be focused on some of that. Focused also on other types of sort of cross-state regulation on looking after people like renters, because again, what we've seen is there was a commitment by the government to do more on renting. more about so trying to coordinate renter standards across the country. I think that's super important because we know that vulnerable people are renting and that we need to get that right. And then I am going to be spending I think time on both spending and also migration because I think migration is an issue which is really important. Is being weaponized by various parts of the community at the moment. And I think we need to be able to have a grown-up conversation on migration without this. And then still tax. We haven't given up on gas tax. We haven't given up on resource taxes. So very busy times ahead. I hope that's stuff that people think that we should care about. And then working with the other indies on things like AI and other environmental concerns and women and some of the stuff that we do. It's not me only, or I'll be working with say Kate and Sophie on things like plastics, ocean plastics, because you can't do everything, but what you just try and do is make sure everything's done.
Right. Well, we might leave it there. Allegra, I'll leave it to you to wrap up.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. It was great. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for being engaged. And lastly, please give me your feedback. I have had a lot of feedback in the last day and a half, things people like, things people really don't like. I need to hear it because it helps me understand, the strengths and weaknesses of what's being proposed by the government. And it's time to really engage and make sure, that you try and get the best out of the government announcements that they've put forward.
And where can people get in touch with you, Allegra?
Probably the best on email, obviously on Instagram and stuff like that. But I think if you've got more if you've got kind of more, more kind of formed out thoughts that you want to put out there, please put them, send us an email.
That email is allegra.spender.mp.
At aph.gov.au. Thanks, Georgie. Good pickup. Bye, guys. See you later. Thank
Thanks
you.
for the questions.